Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into how India is navigating a really tricky global economy to get its own financial house in order, a strategy that's definitely getting some attention on the world stage.
So let's just jump right in. In a world where so many countries are struggling with massive public debt, India's financial management scored at 3 major international credit rating upgrades in a single year. I mean, that is a huge vote of confidence.
So the big question is, how did they pull this off? Well, it wasn't just by chance. The rating agencies themselves said it was all thanks to a very deliberate, multi-pronged strategy. This quote from the Economic Survey really nails it. It's all about prudent fiscal management and shifting spending toward growth-enhancing capital investment.
To really get our heads around this, we're going to break it all down into 6 key parts. We'll start with the big headline success, then dive into the nitty-gritty of how the government boosted its income and spent that money more wisely. And finally, we'll look at the ultimate payoff, getting a better handle on the national balance sheet.
First up, let's talk about what's being called credible consolidation. Sounds a bit jargony, right? But really, all it means is that the government made a clear promise to get its finances in order, and more importantly, they actually followed through.
And wow, this chart really tells the story. The fiscal deficit, which is basically the gap between what the government spends and what it earns each year, has been slashed by almost half since the peak of the pandemic. Now, that's not just some number on a page, it's a huge signal that the government is serious about living within its means, and that's absolutely crucial for long-term economic stability.
Okay, so how do you shrink a deficit that big? Well, it's kind of like a household budget, right? You've got 2 choices. You either spend less or you earn more. India did both, and we're going to start with the earn more side of the equation. There was a huge effort to strengthen the government's revenue streams.
And here's where it gets really interesting. It's not just that the government is earning more, but how it's earning it. This chart shows a pretty significant shift towards direct taxes. We're talking things like personal income tax and corporate taxes. They now make up a much bigger piece of the revenue pie compared to before the pandemic.
One of the really clever tools behind this boost in tax revenue is an approach they call nudge. So instead of just relying on audits and penalties, the tax authorities are using data and behavioral science to kind of make it easier for people to pay their taxes correctly and on time. Think of it more like a friendly reminder than a threatening letter. It's about encouraging people to do the right thing, not forcing them. Okay, so that covers the income side of things, but what about the other half of the ledger, the spending? Well, it wasn't just about cutting costs, it was about spending smarter.
Now, to really get this shift, you've got to know the difference between 2 kinds of government spending. On one side, you have revenue expenditure. That's your day-to-day running costs, salaries, subsidies, interest payments. On the other side, you have capital expenditure, or CAPEX, which is all about long-term investments that will pay off down the road. We're talking about building new roads, ports, and railways.
And this, right here, is the real game changer. As you can see on this chart, the government has been actively shifting money away from those day-to-day expenses and channeling it into capital expenditure. In fact, they've nearly doubled the share of the economy that's being invested in long-term assets like infrastructure. That's a huge bet on the future.
So how did they free up that cash? Well, a big part of it came from making that day-to-day spending way more efficient. Take this number, 3.48 lakh crore. That's the estimated savings over the last decade just by using technology for direct benefit transfers. It makes sure welfare payments go straight to the people who need them, cutting out waste along the way.
But of course, a big country like India can't make these huge fiscal shifts just from the top down. To really move the needle on national investment, you've got to have the individual states pulling in the same direction.
Which brings up a really key question. How do you get all the states to prioritize that same kind of long-term investment in growth, especially when they're all facing their own unique budget pressures?
Well, the central government came up with a pretty sweet deal, 50-year interest-free loans. There was just one catch. The money had to be spent on capital investment. And as you can see from this chart, it totally worked. Without these loans, investment by the states would have actually gone down. This program was a crucial lifeline that kept the money flowing into those long-term projects all across the country.
So we've seen how India has been earning more and spending smarter, both at the national level and with the states. But what's the big payoff here? Well, it all comes down to taming the national debt, the grand total of all the money the government has borrowed over the years.
And this is where India's story really stands out on the global stage. I mean, while many of the world's biggest economies have seen their debt loads actually grow since 2020, India has gone in the complete opposite direction, cutting its debt to GDP ratio by more than 7 percentage points. In today's economic climate, that's a remarkable achievement.
And this isn't some short-term fix, there's a very clear plan for the future. The government has laid out what it calls a fiscal glide path with firm targets. For the current fiscal year, the goal is to get that deficit below 4.5%, and the long-term anchor is to bring government debt down to a much more sustainable 50% of GDP by 2031.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, so let's zoom out and really look at the big picture. What's the key takeaway from India's new fiscal playbook?
It all comes back to that phrase, credible consolidation. This wasn't about painful austerity and cutting back everywhere. It's a much more balanced approach that strengthens stability and supports growth at the same time, all by boosting revenues and investing in the future. And that, right there, is the core reason for those credit rating upgrades we saw at the start.
So there you have it. Through this mix of earning more and spending a whole lot smarter, India has put its public finances on a much more stable footing. The ship has been steadied for sure, but, the economic seas are always choppy. And that leaves us with a final question. Is this new foundation strong enough to weather the next inevitable storm?